Friday mornings in the financial district always carried a nervous energy, but that day the air felt heavier. I had barely finished my first coffee when my phone buzzed with a calendar invite, meeting with Victor Lang. CEO 9:15 a.m. No subject line, no agenda. After 14 years in compliance, I knew what that meant. Victor's office sat on the top floor, glass walls framing the city skyline like a prize he believed he owned. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Clara," he began, his tone rehearsed, "the company is restructuring. Your role is being eliminated." I waited for him to laugh, to admit it was a poor joke. Instead, he slid a manila folder across the desk. "You'll find your severance package inside. There's also a confidentiality agreement. Standard procedure." I opened the folder with steady hands, though my stomach had already dropped. The first page bore my name, my position, and the expected corporate jargon. But as I scanned further, my chest tightened. This wasn't the NDA I had drafted years ago for the company. I knew every clause of that original document, line by line, like a hymn memorized from repetition. This version was different. The section that once allowed disclosure to regulators in cases of suspected fraud was gone, replaced by vague language about absolute confidentiality. Victor mistook my silence for compliance. "You'll, of course, want to sign today. We'd like everything concluded before the weekend." I looked up at him, the man whose reckless decisions I had covered for, whose shortcuts I had quietly corrected to keep the firm in good standing. 14 years of late nights and sacrificed weekends condensed into a handshake dismissal. "I'll review it," I said evenly, sliding the folder back into my briefcase. He nodded, already turning toward his window, dismissing me as though I were a forgotten email. Walking out, I passed colleagues whispering near the elevators, their eyes sliding away from mine. I forced myself to keep my steps calm, but inside, something was shifting. The company hadn't just fired me, it had tried to erase me. And as I stepped back into the noise of the street, I knew the story wasn't ending there, but beginning again with what waited for me to discover on Monday. I returned to my office with the folder heavy in my bag, the weight of it pressing against me like a reminder that everything had shifted in less than an hour. My desk looked the same, files stacked neatly, Post-it notes reminding me of deadlines that no longer belonged to me, but the space already felt foreign. I pulled out a cardboard box from the supply closet and began the ritual of packing. The sound of my stapler clattering into the box seemed louder than usual, as though the walls themselves were marking my exit. I kept my head down, but the murmur of voices drifted through the corridor. "She'll be stepping in next week," one of the junior analysts whispered, not realizing the door was slightly ajar. Miranda Lang, straight from Victor's shortlist. My breath caught. Miranda, the daughter who had never set foot in compliance, who thought corporate governance was a nuisance best left to underlings. She was stepping into the position I had built with 14 years of sleepless diligence. A shadow fell across my doorway. Elena Torres, the HR director, stood there with her clipboard. She didn't look at me directly. "Clara, I'll need your badge by end of day." Her voice was clipped, efficient. She waited for me to hand over the small rectangle of plastic that had been my key to this place for over a decade. When I gave it to her, her eyes flickered briefly toward the floor. She knew. She was complicit. I closed the box and slid it off the desk, the scrape echoing down the hall. Colleagues avoided my gaze, suddenly absorbed in emails or screensavers. The silence around me felt deliberate, as though my departure had already been edited out of the company's story. As the elevator doors closed, I caught a final glimpse of Victor's corner office, sunlight flashing against the glass. They thought they had replaced me with blood ties, but I knew the truth. Nepotism always leaves fingerprints. And when I reached home, I would begin retracing every mark they had left behind. The subway ride home was crowded, but I barely noticed. My thoughts replayed years of service like a film reel I hadn't asked to watch. 14 years condensed into scenes of loyalty that now tasted bitter. I remembered the first crisis Victor had thrown at me. A regulator flagged discrepancies in one of our investment reports. Victor wanted to bury it, but I stayed late, combed through spreadsheets, and corrected every line before dawn. By morning, the regulator had a clean file, and Victor had another reason to treat me as invisible. My silence had protected him. There were dozens of nights like that. I covered for his reckless shortcuts, smoothing edges before they tore the company open. I defended him during hearings, crafting statements that disguised risk as strategy. My reward was a polite nod in the boardroom and an inbox that never stopped filling. The memory that stung most was not corporate. It was personal. Mateo's 11th birthday, the year he asked if I could skip just one meeting to watch him blow out the candles. I had promised I'd be there. Instead, I was in a hotel room 2 states away, cross-checking contracts Victor had rushed through without legal review. That night, I watched a grainy video of Mateo's face lit by candles, my mother's voice singing off-key in the background. I whispered happy birthday to a screen while my son looked around the table for a mother who wasn't there. Then there was the winter he was hospitalized with pneumonia. I sat beside his bed, laptop open, fingers typing an audit response while the monitor beeped. Mateo had stirred awake, asked if I was working again. I told him it was just one more file. It was always just one more. Now those sacrifices pressed on me like weights I'd carried willingly, only to be discarded without ceremony. Loyalty had cost me time I couldn't reclaim, moments I couldn't relive. And for what a cardboard box and an NDA designed to silence me, I unlocked my apartment door, set the box on the table, and pulled out the folder Victor had given me. The paper smelled of fresh ink, and somewhere inside, I knew it carried the first crack in his empire. I cleared space on the dining table and laid out the folder Victor had pressed into my hands. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the radiator, but my mind buzzed louder than the city outside. I read the document once, then again, line by line. My lawyer's instinct awakened like muscle memory. The more I scanned, the more wrong it felt. I pulled out my old lockbox from the closet, the one where I kept past drafts, regulatory notes, and contracts I had fought to preserve. From the bottom of the stack, I retrieved the original NDA I had drafted for the company years ago, complete with my annotations in blue ink. Side by side, the 2 versions looked like twins at first glance, but one had been altered, its features twisted into something unrecognizable. In the original, Section 4.2 stood as a safeguard employees were permitted to disclose information to regulators in cases of suspected fraud or criminal activity. It was a clause I had argued for fiercely, a safeguard that had earned me raised eyebrows in the boardroom but had ultimately been accepted. Now, in Victor's new version, that clause was missing. In its place sat vague language about absolute confidentiality under all circumstances. I traced the words with my finger. This wasn't oversight. It was intent. By erasing the clause, Victor had effectively gagged anyone who might expose what was happening inside. And with my signature, I would have been trapped in that silence. I leaned back, the weight of the discovery pressing into my chest. If regulators ever saw these conflicting documents, the implication was clear: every concealed deal, every misrepresentation could be recast as fraud, shielded only by a manipulated contract. And the person who had signed those contracts wasn't me, it was Victor himself. The ink on his signature would become the noose around his empire. I gathered both documents, slid them into a fresh folder, and locked them away again. My years of silence had been his shield. Now, They might become the blade. And as dawn broke faintly through my window, I knew I had to dig deeper into what else had been rewritten. The following Monday, I arranged to meet Elena Torres for coffee in a quiet shop 2 blocks from the office. She looked exhausted, her eyes shadowed, her usual crisp demeanor dulled. For a moment, we sat in silence, the hiss of the espresso machine filling the gap. Then she leaned forward and said what I had suspected but needed to hear. "They did the same to me," she whispered, "5 years ago. They rewrote the NDA after I discovered irregularities in payroll allocations. I wanted to escalate, but Victor called me in, put a new contract in front of me, and reminded me about my mortgage. I signed." Her hand trembled slightly as she stirred her coffee. It wasn't just complicity, it was fear. Fear that had chained her to silence. My chest tightened with a mix of pity and anger. Victor had been refining this tactic for years, weaponizing loyalty and vulnerability until no one dared speak. Back in my apartment, I opened my laptop and began combing through archived contracts. Hours bled away as I scrolled line after line, looking for patterns. The irregularities were subtle consulting agreements filed under shell entities, invoices inflated for advisory services, payments scheduled with precision around reporting deadlines, then one name repeated often enough to stand out: Lang Strategic Consulting, a company controlled not by Victor directly but by an LLC tied to his brother-in-law. And the payments. They weren't just corporate slush, they were linked to federal infrastructure projects, contracts funded by taxpayer money. I leaned closer to the screen, my pulse quickening. This wasn't mismanagement or creative accounting. It was siphoning. Government dollars were being funneled into private pockets under the cover of NDAs that gagged anyone who stumbled across the truth. The scale of it made my stomach twist. Every altered contract, every silenced employee was another brick in a wall built to protect theft at the public's expense. This was no longer a matter of career revenge. It was a matter of law. And if I pushed this forward, Washington would not look the other way. I closed the laptop slowly, my reflection faint in the darkened screen. The silence around me felt charged, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Tomorrow, I would need to find someone I could trust to help me carry this weight. The next morning, I found an email in my personal inbox, unsigned but carrying enough subtle hints that I knew who had written it. "Meet me after work. Don't bring anything you can't afford to lose." The address was for a small library branch on the east side, the kind of place where few would think to look for clandestine conversations. I arrived just before closing. In the back corner, among dusty shelves, stood Noah Patel, one of the youngest associates in compliance. His expression carried the nervous determination of someone who had rehearsed this moment a dozen times. "I shouldn't be here," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't watch what they're doing to you. It's wrong." From his backpack, he pulled a flash drive and slid it across the table. "It logs," he explained. "I pulled them before they could be scrubbed. 3 weeks ago. Miranda accessed your account from a workstation in her father's office. She copied files tied to your audits, the same ones they later claimed were mishandled. I plugged the drive into my laptop later that night, my breath catching as lines of code confirmed his words. The timestamps were precise, the user credentials unmistakable. The trap they had set for me had been built on stolen access. Closing the laptop, I thought of Noah's face, young, earnest, terrified of the risk he had taken. By giving me this, he had placed himself in the same shadow I now lived under. If Victor discovered the leak, Noah's career would end before it began. The weight of the choice pressed down on me. I finally had proof strong enough to pierce the corporate armor Victor had built, but using it meant exposing an ally to the same ruthless machine that had chewed through me. I tucked the flash drive into the same folder that held both versions of the NDA, the pieces of a puzzle nearly complete. My next step would decide not only my fate but his, and I knew Victor wasn't finished playing his game. The call came late in the evening, when the city lights flickered against my apartment window and Mateo was already asleep down the hall. Victor's voice was smooth, almost cordial, as though the last 2 weeks had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. "Clara," he said, "I want to make this right. The separation package was rushed. I've spoken with the board. We can offer a revised settlement 6 figures, generous terms." And his tone sharpened. "Your position reinstated, senior title, more authority than before." I let the silence stretch, listening to my own pulse. He wasn't offering generosity, he was dangling a muzzle. "What's the condition?" I asked finally. He exhaled softly. "All we need is your signature on the updated NDA, absolute confidentiality, no exceptions. After all, you wrote the first one. You understand the spirit of it." The spirit of it. I looked at the folder on my desk, the altered clauses highlighted in yellow ink. Signing would mean erasing the safeguard I had once fought for. It would mean burying proof of fraud behind my own name. For a flicker of a moment, I imagined saying yes. I imagined Mateo's tuition secured, the relief of not worrying about bills, the comfort of sliding back into the office I knew so well. Stability, safety, normalcy. But then I saw the chain that would follow the whispers, the complicity, the knowledge that my silence was the final stone Victor needed to seal the vault on his crimes. My son would graduate with his future intact, but he would never know the cost I had paid in truth. "I'll think about it," I said at last, my voice steady. Victor didn't hear the resolve under those words. He only heard possibility, and he ended the call satisfied. I set the phone down, my hand trembling. The temptation of silence had been real, but the trap was clear. I couldn't let him buy me. Not now. Not after everything I had uncovered. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of turning his own weapons against him. The morning I sent the archive, I felt strangely calm. Years of files, contracts, and screenshots compressed into a single encrypted folder and dispatched to the compliance regulators with a quiet click. I didn't need to dramatize it. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could. Then I waited. 3 days later, I was summoned back to the building I thought I'd left for good. The elevator ride to the top floor felt longer than usual, every number lighting up like a step toward reckoning. When the doors opened, I was ushered into the boardroom. The space was glass-walled. The skyline stretched out in sharp angles behind Victor Lang, who sat at the head of the table in his tailored suit. Around him, the board members sat stiffly, flanked by 2 regulators whose briefcases lay open, papers already spilling across the polished surface. Miranda was there too, pale but defiant, her jaw set as if sheer will might rewrite the logs tied to her name. The regulators began methodically, side-by-side comparisons of NDAs, the original draft with my notes, and the altered version used to silence employees. Clauses missing, signatures inconsistent, dates that betrayed fabrication. Then the IT logs appeared on the screen, highlighting Miranda's unauthorized access to my accounts. The timestamps undeniable. Victor tried to interrupt, his voice booming across the glass. "This is a witch hunt." Clara was a disgruntled employee, but his words collided with evidence thicker than air. One regulator held up the audit trail, printed copies of contracts funneled through shell entities, payments tied to federal projects. Another read aloud an email chain in which Victor himself approved inflated invoices. The board shifted uncomfortably. Men and women who once laughed at his jokes now stared at their notepads, avoiding his eyes. Victor's composure cracked, his voice slipping from confidence to rage, then to pleading. I sat quietly at the far end, hands folded, watching the storm I had only nudged into motion. Each page turned was another strike against him, each silence from the board another nail in the coffin he had built. When the meeting adjourned, Victor's shoulders sagged under the weight of his unraveling empire, and I knew the collapse had only just begun. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. News outlets ran headlines about frozen contracts and pending federal inquiries. Clients who had once boasted about their ties to Lang Capital were suddenly issuing public statements of reviewing business relationships. The stock ticker scrolling across my television bled red. Each percentage drop another fracture in the empire Victor had built on deception. Inside the office, chaos became routine. Regulators demanded files. Board members held emergency calls, and whole departments whispered in corners. Miranda's resignation came swiftly, wrapped in the bland language of personal reasons. I saw her leave the building with sunglasses on, a resignation letter folded in her hand like a shield against the cameras waiting outside. Victor did not retreat quietly. He stormed into the smaller conference room where I had been asked to wait, his face flushed with fury. Tie askew. You, he spat, pointing a trembling hand. You've poisoned this company. After everything I gave you, I rose from my chair, steady, the years of loyalty and sacrifice condensed into a single truth that no longer trembled in my chest. You made me sign silence, I said, my voice low but clear. You forgot silence can echo. For a moment, he stared at me as though the words themselves carried weight he couldn't bear. His shoulders slumped, rage hollowing into something closer to disbelief. Then he turned away, muttering about lawyers and appeals, but his voice carried no conviction. I walked out into the corridor, the hum of phones and the click of hurried footsteps surrounding me. Yet in the midst of collapse, I felt a strange calm. The company was unraveling in real time, the lies crumbling under the pressure of truth, and I had become both witness and catalyst. By evening, the board had stripped Victor of his executive powers pending investigation, and whispers of his permanent removal were already circling. I left the building not as an employee or a victim, but as someone standing outside the ruins, waiting to decide whether the wreckage still held a place for me. 2 weeks after Victor's fall, I received a letter with the board's seal. The language was polished, formal, heavy with contrition. They wanted me back senior compliance officer, full authority to rebuild the department, a promise that my voice would never again be ignored. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside. The irony was almost bitterly sweet. After years of silence, they were finally offering me power. But the truth was, I no longer wanted it. That building, with its glass walls and whispered hallways, carried the scent of betrayal too deeply etched into its steel. A week later, I met with executives from a rival firm. They had watched the collapse from across the river and saw an opening. We don't need you to sit behind a desk, their managing partner told me. We need you to teach us how not to become them. The offer was clear advisory role, independent, with the freedom to guide rather than shield. I accepted. Now my mornings begin not in skyscraper boardrooms, but in a small cafe overlooking the Hudson. I sit by the window with my laptop open, the river moving steadily beneath the bridges, carrying the city's secrets out to sea. Mateo sometimes joins me, his textbook spread across the table. The future I almost bartered for, finally secure without compromise. When I glance at the skyline, I see the tower where I once worked. The lights on its top floor are dark. Victor's office empty. the glass reflecting only the city beyond. Revenge didn't come with confetti or applause. It came with vacancy, with the quiet acknowledgement that the seat of power can be taken, and sometimes the sharpest justice is to leave it barren. I close my laptop and sip my coffee, the bitterness grounding me. I didn't reclaim Victor's throne. I built something higher beside it, where his shadow can't reach. And that, I realize, is the kind of silence worth keeping.